We're here in front of the Indigenous History of Prince Edward County exhibition, which resides permanently at Macaulay Heritage Park. This exhibition was created in 2019. That's when it opened to the public. And it's meant to be a permanent installation here, but we do consider it to be quite organic and fluid because we add to it and alter it almost every season, depending on what our First Nations contributors and partners would like to see in the space. The modern interpretation of a Haudenosaunee regalia, which you can see here, was created by Narda Yulg, who is a member of Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory and a Mohawk woman. Narda is a long-standing volunteer here with the museums as well, and we are incredibly grateful for all of her insight into this exhibit. She was heavily involved in the creation of it. Really, the purpose of opening the Indigenous History of PEC exhibition was to draw the attention away from what had been focused on previously, which was strictly the past. The idea of Indigenous peoples in the county as a fixture of the county's past and not the county's present and future. So that's something we wanted to focus on considerably with this display. But before you can talk about the future, you sometimes do have to look backwards, so we'll head there now. Now, this piece, this ancient grinding stone, a set of two stones really, a pestle and a mortar, this is probably upwards of 3,000 years old. It was supposedly discovered in Prince Edward County and donated to the Prince Edward County Museums and to this particular museum in the mid-1970s. Now, it has become a very important piece of not only this display, but the museum's general programming. A good friend of the museums, Gahet Dr. Janice Brandt, also a member of Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory and a member of the Bear Clan. She noticed this piece in 2018 and was eager to work with it. And my former curator and I were very happy to let her try using this piece to actually grind corn, beans, rice, and anything else that Janice could think of. We have a wonderful video, professionally shot, of Janice using the grinding stone. She speaks to its history and its importance, and she uses it to grind all sorts of different foodstuffs, many of which are grown in her very own garden, and are, for the most part, heirloom or indigenous seeds. Seed varieties that the Gundege Seed Sanctuary preserve. They are located in Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. Janice also helped prepare for us this little educational booklet, which is all about the grinding stones. It accompanies the video that she is featured in and is a wonderful resource for school children in particular, but everyone can benefit from it. It focuses on the importance of Indigenous technologies and what we can learn from them using the grinding stone as an example. Now, when we were designing the Indigenous History exhibition in conjunction with our partners, Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, specifically the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and also Alderville First Nation, it was important that we, again, speak to the past, but also the idea of establishing a timeline, a basic outline of who was here when. Certainly our visitors are always very curious to know which First Nations have resided here in Prince Edward County or passed through. So this timeline provides a very basic introduction to that. We do know that Prince Edward County has a long and complex Indigenous history, with many different nations living here even at the same time, overlapping considerably in order to share in the wealth of resources that Prince Edward County had to offer. So we can see here a map of Prince Edward County that has numbers scattered across it, speaking to the sites that have been found in Prince Edward County associated with First Nations people. One site in particular is quite interesting to me, which is this site, number 1, located on East Lake. And this is where there was an important discovery of an East Lake Point, or the East Lake Point. It was a spear point made of a material called Rama quartzite, which is a material that is only found at the northern tip of Labrador. When it was discovered in 1983 by a team of archaeologists from the Royal Ontario Museum, it was dated at around 2,000 years old. It is a very interesting indicator of the complex trade routes that existed between First Nations at that time. So now that we've spoken a little bit about items in our collection that speak to just how long there has been presence here, human presence in Prince Edward County, and it does span back about 12,000 years, we will talk about the last few centuries here after the Loyalist arrival in the area, because this was a part of the Indigenous history of this area that was entirely neglected by our museums until very recently. United Empire Loyalists are often associated with the county. Of course, there was a huge influx of them to the area in the 1780s and 90s after the American Revolution ended. And the British government needed to engage in negotiations with the First Nations people living in the area at that time in order to resettle these Loyalists. Now, the Mississauga First Nation was the nation in the area at the time, and the British government negotiated with them in both 1783 and 1787 in order to secure land for their new settlers. Those two agreements were the Crawford Purchase in 1783 and the Gunshot Treaty in 1787. Now, these treaties are the treaties that govern this particular region. The Crawford Purchase really focused on the land of Prince Edward County. It focused on other areas as well, but it included Prince Edward County, whereas the Gunshot Treaty, which came slightly later, focused on the very western side of Prince Edward County, the northwest corner, moving further west. The Crawford Purchase was negotiated on Carleton Island, which is slightly further east along the St. Lawrence River. And at this negotiation, the Mississauga were offered a combination of hats, coats, and powder and ball for a number of muskets that were given to them. Now, no written documents survive that outline the terms of the Crawford Purchase, but it is, or it has become evident that the Mississauga were under the impression that the land would be shared with the new settlers rather than handed over entirely. But I think that we all know that the colonial perspective of land ownership is very different than the First Nations approach to land ownership. So the idea that the British had given these hats and coats and muskets to the Mississauga, that meant that the British were then under the impression that they would own the land. So in 1784, when the Loyalists arrived, the land was carved into lots for them of 100 acres or 200 acres or more, and the Mississauga were relegated to the islands in the Bay of Quinte and eventually left the area entirely, resettling at Alderville First Nation. I find it interesting that when I was in school, I only learned two terms when it came to Indigenous history, and those terms were the Iroquois and the Algonquin. Of course, these were meant to represent the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations. Iroquois was meant to represent that group of people, and Algonquin, which is actually the name of a nation, was meant to represent Anishinaabe peoples. And so those terms encompassed so many more unique nations than I was ever aware of in school. And I really only learned about these two different groups of people and how they related to colonial powers. The Iroquois were traditionally allied with the British, and the Algonquin were traditionally allied with the French. And we were taught that the Iroquois and Algonquin were consistently at odds. And so I wanted to point out this sculpture by artist Laurie Laforme, which shows two Indigenous figures under a cloak. And on the cloak is a representation of the Ojibwe friendship belt that is in itself a representation of an agreement to be peaceful between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. When we completed the exhibition in 2019, or at least the incarnation of the exhibit as it was then, it ended on the topic of residential schools and individuals living in Prince Edward County or this region that would have attended them. Because we do know that there were individuals from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory that attended the Mohawk Institute in Brantford and Shingwalk Indian Residential School in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. These stories, the stories of survivors, those that attended these schools, are extremely important. And certainly going forward with the creation of a new exhibit called A Path Forward in partnership with Jijunhat Ungwawana, the Language and Cultural Center in Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, as well as the Downey Wenjack Fund, we will be working on this exhibit that discusses what we can all do collectively to work toward a better future and to help actually fulfill the calls to action set forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I do want to bring attention to an amazing book that was recently published by Jijunhat Ungwawana, the Language and Cultural Center in Tyendinaga, about survivors of these two residential schools. And the TTO has also acknowledged that there are other survivor stories that have not been addressed yet. I do encourage everyone to reach out to TTO through their website or their Facebook page in order to purchase a copy if you can. And for those of you who aren't able to purchase a copy, there is a copy available here at the museum for you to read. The museums have countless archaeological remnants here in our collection that have been donated over generations, because people in Prince Edward County have been collecting archaeological ephemera from their properties for hundreds of years. And while it is important to use these artifacts to help create a more fulsome history of who was here and when, it's also important to remember that these items, which are from a distant past, are not the only evidence of First Nations people living in Prince Edward County, and that there always has been and will continue to be a vibrant Indigenous community here in Prince Edward County and our region. For example, these items are pottery sherds that date to the late Woodland era, so between 900 and 1300 AD, or CE, as those of us in the museum field would like to say, the Common Era, and were likely created by the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, who are a First Nations group that were here in the county between 12 and 1500 CE. Prince Edward County has been inhabited by humans for 12,000 years, since the ice receded from this part of what is now Ontario. And over the course of that time, there have been many different First Nations that have lived here and utilized the resources here. Many, many nations have traveled through and used Prince Edward County historically, and this is what gives Prince Edward County a rich and diverse human history, but also a very complex and layered one. And I think that's important for visitors to our museum and to the county to understand. After the American Revolution ended, Loyalists were not the only individuals that settled more permanently in this area. Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory was created in 1784 as part of the Mohawk Tract. The Mohawk Nation had been allied with the British during the American Revolution in order to protect their traditional territories in New York State. Once these lands were lost, they were also in need of an area in which to settle. And so the British government negotiated, again with the Mississauga, a transfer of over 92,000 acres on the north shore of the Bay of Quinte that would be used for 20 Mohawk families led by John Deserantion. John Deserantion and these 20 Mohawk families arrived in 1784, but over the next 2 to 3 decades, that 92,000 acres would be considerably cut down by the arrival of more white loyalists to the area, and the British government would claw back a good percentage of that acreage in order to settle these new people of European descent.